Disclaimer: the following program is designed to offend, provoke, and challenge your religious sensibilities. It contains content that will likely offend anyone who holds religion sacred. This is for those with thick skin or a taste for the harsh truth. If you're easily offended or cherish your religious views, please turn off now. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned. Welcome back to Trolled the Verse, where we don't just read the Bible, we drag it like a wiener in the dirt, verse by verse. Last episode, Jesus broke Sabbath law to let his disciples eat raw grain. Now, he walks into a synagogue, spots a guy with a busted hand, and decides this is the perfect time for another rule violation. He heals him in public on the Sabbath. And instead of being impressed, the Pharisees start planning his murder, because helping someone is fine, just not on the day that God takes a nap. All right, this is part 2 of Matthew 12, and if you're new here, we've got full playlist for Genesis, Matthew, and Revelation, all starting at chapter 1 and rolling downhill fast. Check those out for the full descent into scriptural madness. Also, like, comment, and subscribe. Follow us on X at VersatrolYT, unless it's Saturday. Wouldn't want to commit the grave sin of clicking on a Saturday. So after that absolutely flawless defense of breaking the Sabbath in the grain field, Jesus walks straight into a synagogue where the Pharisees are already waiting for him. And because they have nothing better to do than nitpick, they immediately set a trap. They question him, saying, "Is it lawful on the Sabbaths to heal?" Oh, they think they're clever. They're setting him up, knowing full well he won't pass up the chance to turn this into a statement, because if he heals this guy, boom, Sabbath violation. They're not even questioning his ability to do it. They're flat out assuming it'll happen. Let's pause on that. These are his enemies, and yet they're so sure he can perform a miracle that they're just waiting on timing. If even the Pharisees expect it, then Jesus' miraculous work must have been downright predictable. Even better, they care more about catching Jesus breaking a rule than watching a man get his arm back. It's kind of like, yeah, miracle, whatever, but did you clock in on Saturday? This means two things. Jesus' miracles were so routine that even his enemies assumed they were legit. The Pharisees cared more about winning an argument than seeing a man healed. And Jesus, in his typical Jesus way, doesn't give a direct yes or no. He never does. Instead, he pulls out a parable about a sheep falling into a pit on the Sabbath. What man of you will be having one sheep, and if this fall on the Sabbaths into a pit, will not lay hold on it and raise it? So what he's saying is, if you guys had a sheep in trouble, you wouldn't leave it there, right? So why should I leave this guy suffering? It's a decent comeback, but it also manages to prove the Pharisees' point at the same time. Why? Because Jewish tradition already allowed for certain emergencies, like an animal in immediate danger. And under Pharisaic tradition, only life-saving care was permitted on the Sabbath. Fixing long-term conditions was not permitted. So this wasn't a gray area, it was a direct challenge. The man's withered hand wasn't a life-threatening condition. He'd lived with it, presumably for some time. Another day wouldn't kill him. So is this really an emergency? Or is Jesus just itching to break a rule in the most public way possible? This may sound nitpicky coming from me, but logically, if this was purely about compassion, Jesus could have said, "Meet me at sundown," or "Stop by tomorrow." The Sabbath would be over and the miracle wouldn't cause a stir. Or heck, if he can heal long distance like in other stories, maybe he could do it from across town, quietly, but that's not what he does. He performs the healing right there in front of the Pharisees, almost daring them to flip out. He's clearly going for maximum shock value rather than a discrete fix. There's also the question of whether doing a miracle should even count as work. If it's divine power, is God breaking his own Sabbath? Technically, that'd be God's problem, right? But the Pharisees treat it like manual labor, and Jesus does it anyway. And sure enough, he gets the reaction he wants, and the Pharisees, having gone forth, held a consultation against him how they might destroy him. So here's what just happened. The Pharisees set the trap, and Jesus walks right into it. He justifies it with a sheep and a pit parable. Even though Jewish law already allowed emergency rescues, the man's injury wasn't urgent, but Jesus heals him in public to prove a point. Now, there's a lot of problems here in this one section, and we're going to talk about each of them. First, the Pharisees respond to Jesus' healing by hatching a murder plan, which is hilarious in its own right. They're so mad about a Sabbath violation that they immediately start conspiring to kill him. If they're so devoted to not working on that day, maybe they should wait until Sunday to plan a homicide. But I guess that didn't cross their mind. The result is you've got a contrast between healing a hand and plotting a murder, all under the same roof, presumably on the same day, which, good job, Pharisees. Nothing says God's law quite like planning to break the thou shalt not kill law on a Saturday, because you're outraged somebody else worked on the Sabbath. What about the Ten Commandments? More like optional guidelines for all these idiots, Jesus included. What's also interesting is how these gospel accounts flatten the Pharisees into a single cartoonishly evil mob, like they're all sharing one brain cell and a deep hatred of kindness. But historically, Pharisees were anything but monolithic. There were major internal debates, most famously between the schools of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel's crowd emphasized mercy, patience, and ethical reasoning. Basically, don't be a jerk. The Shammai gang, more like rulebook hardliners who'd slap the scroll out of your hand if you sneezed wrong on the Sabbath. And funnily enough, Jesus often agrees with Hillel. That golden rule bit in Matthew 7:12, it's a direct echo of Hillel's line from Shabbat 31, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. The problem is that kind of nuance ruins the story. So Matthew just paints all Pharisees as Shammai on steroids, legalistic, joyless, and apparently homicidal if you restore a guy's hand on the wrong day. Lumping them together makes the contrast cleaner. Jesus is the misunderstood rebel, and the Pharisees are the rigid, petty gatekeepers who just can't handle a miracle. No complexity, no diversity of thought, just an angry, robed hive mind there to boo every good deed. Meanwhile, no one mentions the man's reaction. But I'll talk about it in a bit. He's just a prop in this showdown. He gets his hand back, and then it's curtains for him. End of story. At least King Jeroboam, who had a miraculously shriveled hand in 1 Kings 13 verses 4 through 6, got some lines afterward. Here the healed man might as well vanish into the background. There are parallel passages to this story in Mark chapter 3 verses 1 through 6 and Luke chapter 6 verses 6 through 11, which sometimes show different nuances, such as Mark explicitly mentioning Jesus was angry at their hardness of heart, but all the stories boil down to the same contradiction. A miraculous healing is fine, but not on the Sabbath. And if you do it anyway, well, that's worthy of death. One of the biggest differences here is in how the Pharisees behave. In Mark, they watch him. No conversation, no setup, just standing there like creeps, waiting to see if he'll heal. But in Matthew, they question him. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So they can accuse him. Totally different scene. Either they're silently spying or directly confronting him. Can't be both. And that shift matters. Mark makes them look cautious. Matthew makes them look like prosecutors. Same miracle, different villains. But yeah, no contradiction here at all. Totally airtight gospel harmony. And things get even shakier. If this healing actually happened in a synagogue on the Sabbath in front of Pharisees, we'd expect to see it recorded somewhere outside the Gospels. Not just Roman archives or dusty scrolls, but the Talmud. That massive collection of Jewish legal commentary from the very Pharisaic tradition Jesus was supposedly offending. They documented all sorts of Sabbath violations and debates, like whether you could move a lamp or tie a knot, or what happens if your donkey falls in a ditch. Yet somehow, a public miracle that ends with a murder plot doesn't make the cut. No mention of that time we all watched a guy's hand unwither in real time. No infamous healing that caused outrage in Galilee. Zip, zero, nada, zilch, recorded on this. If this really happened in a first century synagogue, in front of religious leadership, you'd expect some kind of consequence. Sabbath law wasn't a joke. This wasn't just Jesus breaking a rule. This guy was part of it. Whether he wanted to be or not, he became the center of a public Sabbath violation. Which means you have to ask another question: would there have been fallout for this healed guy? Almost definitely. Being shunned, kicked from synagogue, losing community status. It's not a stretch, but the Gospels don't care. He's a one-scene prop in the Jesus-Pharisees drama, and once he serves his purpose, the story drops that poor healed guy like a hot potato. Which kind of tells you everything about how these stories work. The miracles aren't about people. They're about Jesus getting the spotlight, and the rest of the cast just vanishes when the scene's over. And if the guy did start telling everyone about his restored limb, you'd think at least someone would have thought to record the fiasco. But again, it's nowhere in rabbinic tradition, not even a cryptic footnote. which pushes us to wonder if this story is less public spectacle with deep historical roots and more theological anecdote staged to highlight Jesus' rebellious streak. After all, it's a perfect setup. A hero who breaks the Sabbath for a good deed, cartoon villain Pharisees who lose their minds, and a miraculous exclamation point that leaves the poor guy with a newly functional hand. Great for drama, questionable for actual history. But hey, if your donkey falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, they've got instructions for that. Healing a human in front of a bunch of legal scholars, though, I guess it wasn't worth even a passing Talmudic blurb. But a dude tying his sandal wrong? That made the cut. Which says a lot about how likely it is that this showdown really went down the way Matthew spins it. So, after deliberately provoking the Pharisees, enraging them enough to plot his murder, Jesus suddenly decides to withdraw, like, oh no, they're coming after me. What did he expect? He just went out of his way to break their most sacred rule in front of a synagogue crowd, stirring up a massive confrontation, and now he's surprised they might be gunning for him? For someone who claims to be lying low, he's still drawing big audiences everywhere he goes. People keep following him, and because he can't help himself, he heals them all. But then we get this, he charged them that they might not make him manifest. So he's out here performing miracles en masse, yet telling everyone, shh, don't tell a soul, talk about mixed signals. If you truly want privacy, maybe don't cure entire villages. It's like pulling a flashy stunt in Times Square and then demanding nobody pay attention. And to make it even more ridiculous, there's no real mention of how the crowds react beyond the standard, they followed him. You'd think if entire towns were getting supernatural makeovers, we'd get more than a passing nod. This is the public versus private paradox that constantly crops up. Jesus publicly humiliates Pharisees, breaks rules in the busiest places possible, and then flips around to say, but keep it on the down low. He's either the quiet, secret Messiah or the headline-grabbing miracle man in synagogues. You should probably pick a lane. If he's truly anxious about becoming too famous, he might consider skipping the mega miracle tours for starters. Next, Matthew can't resist pulling out the old fulfillment of prophecy line, quoting Isaiah 42, which says, he shall not strive nor cry, nor shall any hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he shall not break, etc. So, in other words, a meek, gentle figure who quietly goes about setting things right without causing a stir, which is hilarious when you consider how Jesus just spent the previous chapters butting heads with religious leaders, calling them out publicly, and, let's be honest, making quite a scene everywhere he goes. If he's not striving, then why is he constantly in theological brawls? If none shall hear his voice in the streets, then what do we call all these crowds he's been preaching to left and right? If he's so gentle, someone should explain that to the merchants he whips in the temple coming soon, or the Pharisees he's been name-calling as hypocrites and blind guides. It's like Matthew just pulled out Isaiah 42 and forced it onto a storyline where Jesus does almost the exact opposite. And context matters. Many Jewish interpretations see the servant in Isaiah 42 as the nation of Israel, not a lone Messiah. But Matthew's hobby is scanning the Old Testament for any verse that can vaguely align with something Jesus does. Loud or quiet, it doesn't matter. They'll always have a prophecy for it. And that's the pattern in the Gospels. If Jesus is loud, they quote, he shall proclaim justice. If he's quiet, he shall not cry out. If he's sweet, he's gentle and lowly. If he's flipping tables, zeal for thy house. It's almost comedic how they shoehorn random scriptures to fit whichever version of Jesus they need at the time. And we get this last line. It says, in his name shall nations hope, which is very inspiring, except Jesus himself says in Matthew 15, verse 24, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, which makes him pretty exclusive, not exactly a global superstar. The real outreach to Gentiles starts after Jesus' departure. Paul's the one who spearheads that movement well beyond Jesus' own ministry. So the line about nations feels like a later addition once non-Jews started joining in. If Jesus was really ministering to throngs of international onlookers, healing whole regions, preaching to foreigners, you'd think someone outside the Gospels might have noticed, like, say, Josephus, but nothing. People love to bring up Josephus like he's gospel adjacent, so let's talk about what he actually says. First, there's Antiquities 18, the famous Testimonium Flavianum. He mentions a wise man named Jesus who did some surprising feats and got crucified under Pilate. That's it. No crowds, no miracle tour, no multitudes of Gentiles. And to make it worse, most scholars agree that part of the passage was later tampered with by Christian editors trying to clean it up, especially that line about Jesus being the Christ and the bit where he supposedly rose from the dead. But the real smoking gun? Look at the last line. Nobody ever mentions this. The tribe of the Christians has not disappeared to this day. That's a red flag the size of the temple. The term Christians wasn't even common when Josephus was supposedly writing this. It doesn't appear in any of his other works, not even once. Not once besides this one instance. For a guy who wrote thousands of lines on Jewish sects, rebels, and weirdos, the fact that this word shows up exactly one time in a paragraph already oozing with Christian theology isn't just suspicious, it's practically a confession. That line reads like it was dropped in by someone trying to prove Jesus was important after the fact. And phrases like, he was the Christ, and he appeared to them alive again the third day. Yeah, those aren't historical footnotes. They're Christian creeds, doctrinal claims that Josephus, a devout Jew, would never affirm. So yeah, Josephus names Jesus, barely, but he doesn't back up the gospel's miracle claims, Gentile ministry, or supernatural hype. If Jesus really was a global phenomenon, Josephus, who loved reporting on Jewish messianic drama, might have said literally anything about it, but he didn't. This makes it look a lot like Matthew spinning the "he's for all nations" thing in hindsight and trying to inflate the story once the movement needed to expand beyond Israel. So my opinion is, this is absolutely not reliable history. Because once you spot clear Christian editing in the paragraph, the whole thing becomes suspect. You don't get to circle one sentence in red pen and say, okay, that part's fake, but the rest is probably fine. That's not how textual criticism works. Some scholars try to recover a tiny, authentic kernel of what Josephus might have originally written, but the entire structure of the passage is contested. It's basically garbage. So yeah, this one lone Christian drop, wrapped in a paragraph already crawling with red flags, basically screams interpolation. It's not just out of place, it's unlike anything else Josephus ever says. And when someone suddenly talks like a 4th century bishop in the middle of a 1st century history book, you don't need a PhD to know something smells off. No matter how you slice it, Matthew 12:15-21 is yet another example of how the gospel writers love to claim prophecy fulfilled, even when the prophecy doesn't quite match up with the Jesus they're presenting. It's also a case study in Jesus's pick-a-lane approach. One minute he's igniting controversy, the next he's supposedly hush-hush about his identity, then back to fulfilling an Isaiah passage about not making a ruckus. If the real Jesus had truly been this massive public figure, healing crowds, tangling with Pharisees, then telling everyone to clam up, maybe the storyline wouldn't be quite so contradictory. But as it stands, it feels like Matthew's forcibly squishing multiple contradictory pieces together and slapping an Isaiah 42 sticker on top, hoping no one notices the lumps beneath. The result? A gentle servant who publicly debates religious elites, a secret healer who can't stop working wonders in front of hundreds, and a Messiah to the nations who seldom steps beyond Jewish turf. If that doesn't make your head spin, I don't know what will. Anyway, like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time in part 3